I'd like to start with an icebreaker first, and it has to do with what happened when we asked ChatGPT about the panel discussion. One fine morning, I was trying to prepare some questions for this discussion, and I was having trouble to come up with good questions, so I opened my ChatGPT window and posted a question. Hey, ChatGPT, we are having a panel discussion on you. What could be a good question for the panelist? And it gave me a list of great questions that I could never have come up with by myself. Okay, so to start with, I think everyone has their own opinion even today about what is ChatGPT. Ihsan, may I start with you and ask you to please help us understand what is ChatGPT, what it can do, and what it can't do, please.
Sure, Hamad, thank you. So ChatGPT is an AI-based conversational bot that can generate articles, that can write computer code, that can also generate customized, tailored content for advertising purposes. So it can generate these coherent, human-like responses to questions you ask of it. So in many ways, I think that it's a breakthrough technology. And the primary value proposition, my humble view, is that it stands to really increase human productivity and efficiency by doing a lot of things that it would take a lot of time for humans to do to be able to do in quick amount of time. And one of the things I think, when I think of ChatGPT reminds me is the innovations that took place as part of the many industrial revolutions we saw. So we saw, for instance, the steam engine, the electricity, telegraph, and the internet. And if we see what these innovations did, they really massively, dramatically increased the efficiency and human productivity. And I think living in the fourth industrial revolution, ChatGPT and ChatGPT-style systems is one of the key innovations for the fourth industrial revolution. So I think it's going to change many verticals for good. And I'm happy to speak more about what its potentials and limitations are. So ChatGPT is trained over large amounts of text that's available on the internet. So it also surfaces many of the biases and prejudices that human text has on the internet. So when using this, one needs to be mindful of its inaccurate answers and incorrect answers. So one big challenge in that regard is that it doesn't provide you with sort of a valid source of where it generated those answers. And it's hard to actually get a precise source because these large language models that ChatGPT belongs to, they are essentially black box models and hard to interpret. And so it makes it very hard to identify back to the source. It's generated this information which seems coherent, and so there is a lot of cognitive ease associated with believability, but it may turn out to be inaccurate or incorrect. And so, as educators, as researchers, as practitioners, it's very important to be mindful of the limitations of ChatGPT-style systems. Yet, we should also be very, very excited about what it would enable in terms of change in industries and verticals going forward.
So, Jessica, what Ihsan said, it seems like it's a kind of a double-edged sword. It is a help, a tutor, a learner, a support for learning outside the class. On the other hand, as Ihsan said, it simplifies some things to an extent that might interfere the natural learning process. So where can we find that sweet spot in this continuum from left to the right, where ChatGPT can be integrated in the learning process?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to really carefully do is consider what is learning, what is knowledge. If we look back to universities, when they were first founded 1,000 years ago, knowledge was memorization and understanding. And to some extent, that is still what it is considered today, is having an amount of knowledge in your head. But if we look at our frameworks, especially if we look at Bloom's taxonomy of learning or understanding, we have different levels of learning or knowing. And the very lowest levels are remembering and understanding. And then we get to the higher levels, which is the application. We have the analysis, we have the creativity. We have creativity. There's all these other higher levels of thinking, of knowing, of learning And really, in universities and in schools, I think by and large, most of our work is with the lowest 3 levels. Maximum is really applying. Not to say that it never ever happens in the higher levels, but for the most part, I think that that's kind of where we're focused on these lower levels. And you know, as we've talked about, the ChatGPT has the potential to make that learning not as, or that way of learning and knowing not as important. You know, all of our technological advances have already changed that. If I have not memorized the equation for the formula of a triangle, I don't have to twiddle my thumbs and say, oh, I didn't learn that in 5th grade. Now I can never figure that out. I just go to Google and I look for it. So the essence of remembering everything and holding all knowledge in your head, it just doesn't exist in the same way as it did before. And it's also not possible. There's so much knowledge that's available. There's so much that is expected now of students and professors and people to understand and know about the world. It is impossible to hold all that knowledge in your head. And so therefore, this is one of those tools that, as he's pointed out here, you still have to be able to do those higher order thinking. You have to evaluate whether or not this answer is a good answer, whether or not it's useful, whether or not it's true. So these higher order thinking skills are still essential to using any sort of technology. We still have to know what we're using and how we're using it.
Technology, education. I mean, technology has always challenged the status quo, right? And more so in your field, it has been transformed completely. So what is your advice for education leaders on how to embrace technology and keep evolving teaching and learning instead of showing just a knee-jerk reaction?
You know, my reflections about history and lessons from these disruptions ties very nicely to what has been said already. But let me draw on 2 examples, major disruptions that took place. Perhaps one that was before my lifetime, but one certainly that was within mine and people in the room, and then draw some lessons from that. What have we learned from those disruptions? So the first example I would pick, Ihsan mentioned the steam engine. I'd go just a little after that, which was the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine, I'm quite confident most people in the room don't know who actually invented that. And there's a good reason for that. The fellow who actually invented it, his name was Nicholas Otto, back in 1870, that he came up with a design for this engine. But you know, it just sat on his shelf and it didn't do anything. It was a great invention, but it just sat there for 30 years before someone by the name who you do know, Carl Benz, Mercedes-Benz, and the whole industry was born because he put that to use. So we then had a car that did something. It had utility. People could see that this is going to change things and disrupt the whole way in which transportation and all the other supply chains that go before and after it would dramatically change the landscape. But he didn't go far enough because there wasn't enough adoption of that car. And it was only until Henry Ford came 10 years after that that it became something very accessible and then almost ubiquitous in the lives of many to this day, when we know cars are again being rethought in terms of some of the side effects they have, and now we're thinking EVs, and we're thinking of another whole geography around the whole business of transportation and so on. So that was a major disruption. The other one that's probably closer to ChatGPT is again mentioned about the internet. The example I would pick is the first initial public offering of the browser that came into the market in 1995, and that was Netscape. Some of you in the room might remember that browser which it beeped and very ugly, but people were really excited about this because you could have the whole world on your fingertips, on your desktop, or I'm not sure if laptops were there then. But in fact, what happened to Netscape is that it had 75% market share in the browser market in 1975, and because it was for free, like ChatGPT. You know, you didn't have to pay for it. But then they wanted to monetize that and sustain it. And so they went to for an initial public offering. The valuation of that company at that time was $14 by the investment bankers. But the night before the valuation went public, they said, there's so much interest in this that aap isko double kar dein. Make it go for $28, even though your company is worth half as much. And so they did. And you know, by the end of the month, it was up to $75 and then climbed up. And then the rest is history, because Bill Gates was watching on the sidelines as to the power of this and actually completely destroyed that company through the Internet Explorer. And we know all the rest because he did it in a certain way. Okay, so we have these two major disruptions, right? What have we learned from that? One of the things we learn, and this is very common, is that a major disruption tends to follow an S-curve, right? So you have some initial adopters who are perhaps called lone rangers who really believe in this stuff, but they're very few. And in fact, they tend to be maligned and ridiculed, that this is ridiculous. This kind of invention is going to harm us. And then there's a fear factor that comes in. This might displace us. It might ruin the way we are used to and accustomed to in the way we do things. So as more people start adopting this, and why do they adopt more? It's a very important question. Why does diffusion take place where it becomes, from here to almost a full adoption? That happens because either you get a lot of funding. So a lot of investors then say, we believe in it too. And then perhaps even more important are the perceptions of people as to what the technology will do. So if you add these up, we find that this S-curve then becomes another S-curve, and it becomes, so it sort of evolves on its own, and it keeps going in these loops until people feel very comfortable with it, and they say, that's no big deal. In fact, that is something we expect as we move forward in our learning activities. So one lesson is to think of this as a cycle that will take place sometimes in shorter periods than the one we saw with the internal combustion engine that took 50 years before it really got into our lives. The second, I think, lesson to learn is that something like ChatGPT, it's what we call associated closely with artificial intelligence. People are focusing more on the intelligence, but forgetting that it's still artificial, right? So if you think about that, this speaks to what Jessica was saying earlier on, that when you think of an algorithm like ChatGPT, which is what it is, it's as Ihsan explained, this is an algorithm. An algorithm, I'm not a computer scientist, but I think algorithms are designed to produce outcomes, right? And those outcomes can be foreseen probabilistically and otherwise. So they're contained, right? But human beings are not algorithms. Human beings tend to follow a heuristic. And in a heuristic, what people do is they explore, they have intuition, they kind of use their judgment, they include, both have biases because the algorithm now with deep learning is producing all these weird things like we've been reading, I love you. An algorithm is telling you that please leave your wife and marry me. This is one of the recent things that happened to a reporter for the New York Times. And there are all kinds of other things that I'll destroy you, or some real weird things happening that the outcomes were never really thought about from the programmers who designed the algorithm. But human beings, I would believe, know better. And so we too have biases. And so when we work with our heuristics and then think about outcomes, then we too modulate them and we learn lessons from them, and we must have checks and balances. So I see this as another repetition of a major disruption that we will confront with all its bumps and all its hitches, and let's welcome it. Let's embrace it. Let's see what we can do.
Nauman साहब, HSS पे सबसे ज़्यादा शोर मचा हुआ है ChatGPT के हवाले से. ठीक.
Sure.
So what sort of impact do you imagine ChatGPT is going to have on disciplines related to liberal arts and humanities?
Sure. Thank you, Ahmad, for the question and for having me on this panel. So, mera jawab, my question is going to, I belong to the humanities. I'm a humanist, more specifically a philosopher of religion. So, what I'm going to propose to us is a narratival answer of sorts, and it'll become clear at the end why I'm making this choice. Broadly speaking, this is a bit of a caricature, but I'm going to hold to it for this conversation. There are two sorts of approaches we can take about when we're thinking about what it means to be human, which is a central question within the humanities, right? Grappling with what it means to be human. And one approach that we're familiar with is that when you're trying to figure out insan kya hota hai, what it means to be human, you try to figure out something distinctive that sets humans apart from what is other than human. So quick examples that we are all familiar with, human beings are rational animals, yeah, goes back to Aristotle. Or human beings are linguistic animals. So that's one approach you can take, or one approach that humanists have taken to answering questions about insan kya hota hai, specifying a property or something definitional. In response to the question, you gave a definitional answer. Another approach that's also germane to the humanities is that when we think about our humanity, rather than figuring out what is distinct about us, what sets us apart from other than humans, we might emphasize the kinds of relations, networks, and embeddedness that characterizes our lives. A sort of ecological account of ourselves, where when we speak of ourselves, we don't describe an essence or a property. What do we do instead? We narrate a story in which we're locatable. So आपसे पूछा जाए आप कौन हैं, बजाय ये बताने कि भाई ये मेरा essence है, ये चीज़ मुझे distinct या sets me apart from other than human, आप एक कहानी सुनाते हैं, So on the one hand, a definitional property. On the other hand, a broad narrative in which you're locatable as a character. Okay? A narrative in which you emphasize your relations. A narrative in which you emphasize your embeddedness. I think what ChatGPT is helping us see is that approaches of the definitional kind where we're trying to emphasize our uniqueness, might be a bit of a dead end. Because ChatGPT seems to be now doing things that we took to be uniquely human. Yeah? Generating questions for a panel. Embodying or performing a kind of creativity, right? So by performing the sorts of tasks that we take to be uniquely human, I think ChatGPT helps us see that it's best not to locate our humanity in a definitional essence, but to locate it in stories, in networks, in ecologies we're embedded. In fact, I would argue this is how we ought to think about ChatGPT as well. Rather than trying to figure out what is unique about ChatGPT, जब हम सोच रहे हैं कि what is ChatGPT क्या है? Perhaps as a humanist, I would argue we should be thinking about how ChatGPT is transforming the networks in which we participate in, our stories, and the ecologies in which we're embedded. So I think it's cast a vote in favor of relational and ecological accounts of questions about humanity rather than definitional accounts of what it means to be human. So that's my broad narratival answer.
Yasser, is there any future for search engines now after ChatGPT?
I think that definitely there is a room for search. Search does not have that problem of diluting the results that it gets. And search also knows something that ChatGPT doesn't, which I think one of the people here mentioned, which is the relevance of those documents. Right? So in an ideal world, I would think that search allows you to get the relevant documents so that there's which have little bias, which have accurate information, and then summarization or synthesis technology like LLM synthesize that for you. I still think that ChatGPT, it has 175 billion parameters, and it searches through all of the documents, but it can't tell a good document from a bad document. And that is a problem. And that is a problem that Google knows. So it ranks documents because it thinks that this document is better than this one. So search, definitely, I don't see it going away. Many people have been talking about how ChatGPT is going to replace Google. I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned one point that it is another tool for plagiarism. ChatGPT doesn't like itself to be misused for plagiarism. So let me ask it, ChatGPT, how can we detect plagiarism in AI-generated content? Can you help us with that?
Detecting plagiarism in AI-generated content can be a challenging task, as models can produce unique and original content based on the input they receive. However, here are some techniques that can be used. Plagiarism detection software. These tools compare AI-generated text with existing content on the internet to identify any similarities. Reverse search engines. This can help identify any instances where the AI-generated content matches existing content. Linguistic analysis. This can be used to identify patterns in the language and style of AI-generated text and help identify any instances where the AI language model may have copied content from other sources. Manual review. Reviews by human experts such as teachers, professors, or editors can also be an effective way to detect plagiarism in AI-generated content. In conclusion, detecting plagiarism in AI-generated content requires a combination of these techniques.
Okay, thank you, ChatGPT. Now keep quiet until I ask you again, okay?
So my question is primarily with Dr. Arshad. So universities are responsible for both just the skills and how the students think. Now there's a term trending on Twitter that's called based AI, which says that AI or basically ChatGPT or any chatbot is inclined towards one side. They're saying it's more inclined towards the left wing of thinking. So as universities, how can we preserve free thinking that the next coming generation is not just inclined towards one wing or right or left, but they can be neutral, you can say? Or, how can we ensure free thinking?
Wow. You get the best award for the most difficult question. Okay, the university is not going to change its values and its direction because of ChatGPT or any other technology that comes our way. We are grounded in much broader principles and roots and values that will continue no matter what kind of disruptions come that force us either to go left or right. We have self-regulating mechanisms. We have schools that have very different worldviews of what knowledge is, of existential questions, of questions that are very deeply rooted in philosophy. And it is this, ये माहौल है, ये एक इदारा इस तरह का है कि हम ये encourage करते हैं for diversity in thinking, diversity in terms of approaches, and that's the prize at the end of the day for the university, is to bring together a collective where we can have this space, where we can have this free thinking that you speak of. Nobody is going to sacrifice that until and unless someone comes with a sledgehammer. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, it's not ChatGPT that is the sledgehammer. There are many other ways in which people try and shut us up, whether it's in the cause of development or equity or progress. We're constantly being told that you can't do this, you can't do that, this is against this is against that. And that's all right, because that's particularly a role that we take pride in, to break those boundaries, persuade people that what we're trying to do is to improve the well-being of society, and we'll never waver from that.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panel members, Dr. Arshad, Jessica, Ihsan, Yasser, Nauman. Thank you very much for taking the time out. और आप सबका भी बहुत शुक्रिया आने का. Thank you very much.